So before we begin, I just want to give a huge thank you to our panelists for coming out today. We really appreciate it. And now let's introduce them. First we have Eric Kintner. Eric has more than a decade of experience across a broad range of industries. He's able to combine industry-specific knowledge with innovative solutions to help clients address challenges with complex legal and business issues across their local, regional, and global operations. Eric represents clients in a variety of sectors, including healthcare services and digital health, blockchain and digital currency, corporate transactions and securities offerings, internet gaming, sweepstakes, contests, raffles, and social media promotions. Next up, we have Paul Foley, an angel investor, founder of SmartCapital. It's a VC fund which allows anyone to participate, not just accredited investors, and he's on the Colorado Government Blockchain Council. Next up, we have Shala Burroughs. She's the COO of the Satis Group. Prior to Satis, she was a product and research team manager at Bridgewater Associates, a hedge fund that managed over $160 billion for more than 350 clients globally. Prior to her work with Satis and Bridgewater, Shala founded and launched the seed stage tech company and was an intelligence officer with the U.S. government, where she facilitated the coordination of over 76 intelligence officers. Next up, we have Josh Chapman. He most recently worked for Morgan Stanley in their institutional equity division, where he covered the world's top hedge funds and sold over $5 billion in IPOs for companies like Alibaba, Lending Club, Grubhub, Etsy, Shopify, and more. He holds a BA from Wheaton College. And last but not least, we have Larkin Reynolds, an attorney who assists technology ventures with company formation, growth stage transitions, and data security issues at her all law firm, Foundry Legal. She was previously in-house counsel with the Visa Inc. Legal Center of Excellence, Regulatory Enforcement and Compliance Counsel with Wilmer Hale, and a legal fellow at the Brookings Institution focusing on national security law. And now, without further ado, start off with a nice loaded question here. So how should regulatory bodies enact policies to protect consumers without stifling innovation among entrepreneurs?
Go on, Eric.
How they should, or they do?
In an ideal world.
In an ideal world?
Yeah.
Well, I guess I would just pair our friend Peter at Cohen Center, which is sort of a light regulatory touch, I think is ideal. Whether they do that and whether they believe that that's appropriate is probably another policy discussion. But yeah, that would be my general thoughts, at least as applied to crypto, blockchain. So many use cases. I know the prior panels have sort of said there's a few use cases. I'm not sure we really know what those are yet. And I think the more that regulation can try to understand before it implements, or regulators should try to understand before they regulate, is ideal.
I would say it's, to add to that, it's a light regulatory touch and a preponderance of communication after the fact to clarify what the heck they mean by that legislation. For the first 2 years of my career, I worked on a single paragraph of legislation that came out of Congress, and to this day, they have no idea where it came from or what it means. And I think that to take that example and move it to blockchain, I work in security tokens, and I think many regulatory bodies are working their hardest, but will put out guidance and say, see, it's out there, it's clear. And unfortunately, it's so gray that it prevents companies from being able to actually respond to it or abide by it.
I would just say ours, so we're kind of, we're a tokenized venture fund for esports and video gaming. And so we are navigating this literally as we speak, trying to actually be in compliance as an STO in the market today. And I will say that we spend a fortune on legal. And it's very expensive, but it's very worth it because it keeps me out of jail, right? So it's very complicated, it's very hard. Background in finance, passes Series 763, where I know the answers to questions that are 30 years old about hard copies being mailed via courier across state lines to different people that I'm sitting on a trading floor using a Bloomberg. So regulation always is behind innovation. What's tough is over the last, especially 10 years, innovation and technology is obviously doing the hockey stick, and it continues to do that, and regulators are not doing a similar speed of communication with the market. And so it's very, very challenging, but I would say as the founder of a company that has to deal with ramifications of potentially overstepping that bound, we are very consciously trying to stay within the realms of regulation and not trying to, even though we believe in the potential of blockchain and all of its use cases, we are not trying to push that and be too far ahead of regulation, because honestly that causes a lot of problems and is causing a lot of problems for a lot of founders over the last 24 months.
I would just add that one of the hardest elements of being an attorney is working in a space where you don't have a lot of precedent to go on, and yet we like laws that have been around a little bit longer because there's more precedent, there's more case law to draw from when you're advising your clients. So there really is this tension between being able to give good advice because you have something to base it on that you don't think will be you don't think a court would disagree with you as easily, and needing the regulation to actually adapt to the technology that it is being applied to. So while I agree with the light touch generally, I also, and the speeding things up, I also think that on some level, the length of time and the slow pace can be a good thing for companies as well.
Kind of as a follow-up to that, is the current lack of regulation, is that a state or a gap in the law, or is that an opportunity for entrepreneurs? How should they navigate that?
When you mean lack of regulation, what do you mean?
Just the fact that it's pretty unclear where, sort of like this stuff's going to fall with SEC and other regulatory bodies.
So with ICOs specifically?
And yeah,
So Eric is creating there's a Colorado Blockchain Council. One of the biggest things if you're going to do an ICO or a token offering, which can be an effective way to raise money if you have a product and a consumptive purpose for the tokens. One of the things that the Colorado Blockchain Council is doing and what Eric's leading is a digital token framework. So it's saying, hey, this is, if you are going to provide a token offering, here's kind of the exemption carved out from the securities law that would allow you to do this. And I think that's an extremely helpful thing to have if you're going to do an ICO offering. And then the other thing that we're looking at doing is a fintech sandbox. So the idea would be for money transmitter licenses. The idea would be exempting those companies while they're in their early stages so that they can get to production and then comply with registrations and licenses at a later date.
I mean, I guess I would view this question of whether the lack of clarity is an inhibitor or as an opportunity as sort of where you sit on the spectrum. Are you in the crypto because you're kind of an anarchist and you don't really like government and you don't want the banks to control money and you don't understand why the Federal Reserve should have any control over that the money system, and Bitcoin and these sort of peer-to-peer networks is the answer to those problems? In that case, the lack of regulation or the ability to exploit loopholes may be appealing. But if you are a company that's trying to raise capital and you're relying on banks to sort of store the capital that you do raise, or you're relying on institutional investors to come in and put money into your startup, that kind of demands some regulatory compliance, you sort of would hopefully, you reach for and you desire regulatory certainty so that you know you're not going to go to jail for what you're doing. So I think it kind of depends on where you sit. I personally I think I'm on more of the latter in the sense of I think we're going to need to get to a point where you've got regulatory certainty for these new business models, for token offerings, for decentralized exchanges, for option trading, for all these fintech ideas out there in crypto, as well as the Spotify coin that we've always debated in our securities working group on the Blockchain Council. You're going to need to be able to sort of navigate clearly regulatory guidance before you get to a point, I think sometime in the future, probably in our lifetime, I hope, where you will have such a strong, I was listening to Laura Shin's podcast with Barry Siller, referred to it as the Bitcoin highway, you had such a strong Bitcoin highway that you don't need to get off anymore to get into the banks. You don't have to get off to do KYC, you don't have to get off to deal with institutional investors, but we're not there yet. You still have a lot of these on-ramps and off-ramps. So we're gonna have to sort of figure out how to get through this regulatory morass and provide clarity to these companies before we can really get to that point.
I would say as an entrepreneur who's trying to take advantage of the capital markets around crypto, like I've seen it as not an opportunity. The lack of regulation is not an opportunity to me. It's actually like something that we're trying to respect very, very carefully because the future of my company hinges on the success of this, not only just from a business standpoint, but also whether this is legal or not legal, and whether we do it legally or illegally, right? So we have taken the approach that the lack of regulation is something to respect very, very carefully, and I think many people that have gone before me and my team are now dealing with the ramifications of that and are going to be in class action lawsuits for the next 36 months, and that sucks as an entrepreneur because you thought you were being super cool and innovative, but instead you spent the next 5 years in legal proceedings. Like that's actually not unfortunate, that's sad, right? And it's depriving the world of whatever the product you were trying to bring, and somebody counseled you poorly to see the lack of regulation as a cut corners moment than a, hey, take it easy, there's some really great things here. I think I would agree with Eric that I'm more on the latter side of that, but it's something to be very careful of, and we're trying to take the approach of we want to be one step behind regulation instead of ahead of it, because maybe one step ahead, whatever, we want to be a part of the solution without breaking the rules of the process.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think a lot of this and your points here are a really good example of that. It depends on your appetite for risk, whether it's an opportunity or not. So if you're willing to accept the risk of being told no and the consequences and costs of that, then perhaps it is an opportunity. Otherwise, yeah.
If you're a billionaire,
Right, exactly.
you can choose. If your name rhymes with Grad Marlinghouse and you run a company that rhymes with Nibble, then you can do whatever you want. But I think that when you're an actual entrepreneur that's starting and is creating a track record in this environment, I would be more conservative. But that's just me.
Awesome. To pivot a little bit, can anyone on the panel explain Wyoming's stance on blockchain regulation, what they're doing right to inspire innovation?
We, as Paul mentioned, we're sort of working on the Colorado Blockchain Council. We've broken up into groups, and I'm leading the securities working group that is looking at primarily the token legislation that's been passed to date in the United States, and that would be Wyoming Bill 70 and Arizona's sort of intrastate securities token, and thought that Wyoming Bill 70 is a good place to start from. So our new Colorado Digital Token Act is very much kind of based on, it looks like Wyoming Bill 70, though I think we've improved it. We certainly have folks from Consensus that were involved with both, and I think they agree. It's put words in their mouth that we are sort of, I think, working in the right direction. But my sense from Wyoming is they saw an opportunity that as a state has no income tax. They saw an opportunity to potentially bring businesses into the state for which they could potentially benefit, and they had a very willing legislature that sort of took the 5 bills that were offered, made very little changes, and passed them with the hope that if you build it, they will come. And I applaud them for sort of putting a stake in the ground. At the end of the day, at Colorado, we're trying to do the same thing. We're dealing with a state law, a state securities act that you still have to deal with the federal securities acts of 1933 and 34. And the SEC if you were to sell these things across state lines. So we may not be able to make a huge impact, but I do feel like Colorado, Wyoming, and other states that are looking at these areas are, in a sense, a tip of the spear. We are trying to listen to the community, understand what the community thinks and what they're working on for these projects, understand what the regulators believe is the problem with ICOs and with fraud in the market, and address those concerns, and try to establish a new framework for what I hope would be like a regulation blockchain at the federal level, so that companies can go out and sell consumer goods in digital format, a digital token, and not be worried that that is somehow a security. We use the example of Indiegogo a lot in our discussions, and if I can go out and pre-sell, a new, the world's softest sheets, I think Paul talks about, and pre-buy those, and the company uses that money and goes and makes the sheets for me, and I get them a year later. As far as I know, regulators don't seem to be shutting Indiegogo down and the softest sheets company for selling a security. So why can't we apply that same theory to digital tokens?
Can I ask you a question, Eric?
Please.
Sorry, Kieran. When you say, so Wyoming built the first foundation, and you said, hey, Wyoming, we've been able to take that and improve upon it. What are the top 2 ways that you've seen Colorado, and Paul, maybe you can speak to this too, improve on that base? Just because we have the benefit of kind of seeing it play out to begin with.
Yeah, I think there's 3 areas that I think we've improved. This is draft legislation that has not been passed yet. One area, or I guess there's one area that is specifically addressed to the regulators, which they continue to remind us, and I agree with, which is Wyoming bill exempts open blockchain tokens from the Securities Act in Wyoming. Therefore, securities regulators have no tools in their toolbox anymore to shut down fraud. So all of their fraud action, causes of action, are all based on violating the Securities Act. So if you exempt it altogether, there's no ability for them to shut these frauds down, and totally agree. And so we included language that said the Securities Commissioner would have the authority to delay, stop, prohibit, restrict, consume what we call digital token offerings if they perceive fraud or deceit to intend to induce fraud. So number 1, we got to try to address the securities regulators' concerns off the bat. Number 2, I think we've improved by trying to really focus and provide a definition, or maybe an express definition, of what we mean to have a consumptive purpose. So if we kind of rewind and go back to the Howey test you may have heard of, this is a long case long ago about orange groves in Florida, and somehow we're supposed to take this case and apply it to digital tokens in 2018. But in any event, that is the case that we have to rely on. And what we're trying to do with these, quote, consumptive purpose is to avoid the idea, or the third prong in Howey, which is that the token holders are relying on the efforts of a third party to generate profits. And what we're saying is that, no, I'm buying this to consume it. I'm not relying on anybody's efforts to drive profit. So one effort we've made in our act is to try to provide a definition of what a consumptive purpose is, which Wyoming bill kind of touched on, but I don't think did exactly that. The third area that I think we improved on is to explicitly allow the state securities commissioner to enter into compacts with other states, which was an idea that Arizona bill had. Again, to try to create this idea that we develop enough community across state lines where folks are allowed to then exploit that over time and hopefully build some consensus.
And one other thing to add is there's basically a period where the consumptive purpose has to be launched. So, for example, a lot of ICOs are launching their token, and then the consumptive purpose, let's use the Spotify example. So I want to create a music streaming app. It's $10 per month, but instead of charging $10, I'm going to charge a token. I'm going to build this music streaming app. The token launch, we're playing around with the specific time range, but the idea would be the app has to be launched 6 months in advance. So the idea, or 6 months after the token is launched. So that way there has to be consumptive purpose coming up, and also you're limited on exchange until the consumptive purpose is open. So that would make it so the speculation, which you've seen with the ICOs, which are usually the detriment or the things that get the most shady, is, hey, listen, you have to have a product to use the token within a certain amount of time, and before you can go exchanging the token, the consumptive purpose has to be up there, which I don't think is currently in the Wyoming bill.
Yeah, I don't think it is. Just to sort of, not to ask more questions from the panel, but so then, I mean, that's perfect from my perspective. But then how do you define like the consumption itself, or like the app launch, right? I guess that's some sort of MVP. Are there any parameters around that? Because I mean, you can maybe use it. You can use a smart contract within like 5 minutes of building it, right? Like depending on how your app is constructed, and then.
So So we were talking about earlier, like what some kind of like regulation, kind of like uncertainty or clarity. I think one of the things with ICOs that has been completely misused is the mooting principle, where it says buy this coin you get 1,000x, and that's like an investment purpose, and I think that misleads investors, and that's not a consumptive purpose. So the token itself, I think when the commissioner will look at these, it's basically, the idea is I'm going to use this token for some kind of purchase of a product, good content, service, and we were looking at the ticketing app that was up here earlier. Block Party is a good example of this is something you can use if there's a Block Party token. You can exchange it for a ticket or something like that.
But like not just a profile on the system, but you can actually like get like
something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea is you're supposed to be able to use the token for something in the app that has value, and that's why you're selling a token is for the app to be run and used. Now there are prediction markets out there like Honor, for example, and if the token is used for they call it a forecasting or predictive markets, but it could be considered gambling. And if it's used for the gambling purpose, then that is intended for some purpose. You have to look at that.
Yeah.
So
I guess the next part would be, so if I like buy a Nike tennis shoe, right, I can sell that tennis shoe if it's like an exclusive thing on the secondary market, right? And the value goes up every year because it's the Jordans from 90, whatever, right? So now we get into the secondary market, which gets into securities laws. So you buy a consumptive token is different than like me buying like the company's sheets, right? Like I could go sell those on eBay, so technically, why isn't all of eBay and Craigslist a securities exchange, right? So I guess, is that the connection you're trying to make? But the difference with tokens is that the transferability is faster, and it is creating a more liquid market that is just a new reality, right? And so I would try to, I don't know the answer, that's more of a question, right? But
So-
what do you do there?
So let's go back to the Spotify example. So the reason I think ICOs can be potentially a useful form of raising capital for growth rounds is Spotify, let's say, instead of raising, I think they raised $200 or $300 million, could pre-sell their subscription. So they could sell a token that would allow you a month instead of for the $10 for $5. And you as a user could go and buy 2 years worth of those tokens. Now if you're somewhat savvy and you there's plenty of people that do this currently where they go and they buy something off of eBay and then resell it on Amazon. That happens all the time. There are Indiegogo campaigns where people have bought sheets. Like it's not this specific example, but you can buy sheets and then resell them for a higher price at a later date. Those aren't falling under securities. The best example I can give you is gift cards. So let's say you have a $50 gift card that you had won it in a raffle or something, and you wanted to sell it to somebody for $25. That's not a security. That's selling a gift card to McDonald's or Starbucks or other. So the idea would be the consumptive purpose for the gift card example is there's going to be McDonald's burgers at the end of it, right?
I guess on the flip side, if you look at like a Series A round, right, you're raising $10 million, you're giving away 10% of your company. In return, people could get a financial return, which they could get through a tennis shoe or a Spotify if they secondary traded it. But in return, they're just going to wait 10 years until the exit of that company. And in return, they get the money and they say, okay, give me $10 million, then I'm going to go build what I promise I'll build. And oh, by the way, to just fall under this regulation, I'll just throw in a free subscription lifetime to you, right? So where's the blend between?
We're trying, yeah, I mean, these are all great questions. Yeah, so, one area that we focus on is trying to make that the primary purpose of the token is for consumptive. So we can't just throw a little consumptive purpose on that, otherwise 99% speculative investment. And that's obviously going to be where the regulators have to come and say, what's primary, what's not. The process would be you sort of notify the Securities Commission, this is the exemption I'm going to use. So you allow at least put yourself on their radar so they can monitor as needed. But what we're struggling with is how much should people be able to pre-sell tokens before they're live, use that for capital raising purposes, which sounds much more like a security than somebody who already has a minimum viable product like Spotify and just wants to issue their subscriptions or whatever access they want in a form of token instead of a membership, or they want to The example using Nike, I know Marco has raised this on other podcasts I've listened to about, if Nike were to issue a token and it gives them, that token holder, access to the latest and greatest new LeBron James shoes before everybody else, and allows them to even maybe vote on certain things. Like where do you start crossing the line of these current consumable good products that in some ways start tokenize some of their loyalty, some of their rewards programs, some of their accessibility. This is where I think we're focused on initially with the Digital Token Act, is to say, look, if the longer you get away, in our view, from when you go live and when you sell the token, the more it looks like speculative, the more ability for a fraudster to come in and take a bunch of money and then turn the lights off and disappear. So in our view, the best practice is probably you're going to have to do some early stage seed round to get your product to a point where you're ready to go, where you have a consumptive purpose, it's ready to go active, and then use this next step to be able to drive growth. And that to us seems like an option that people should be able to do, again, if the token economics make sense, without running afoul of securities laws. That's the theory.
So one thing I want to differentiate, because I'm hearing us talk a lot about issuance, so actually issuing the token, which is very different, which becomes very different when you start actually consuming it. And I would say the one differentiation I want to make is if Nike sells these tokens and they're only available on a closed-end system. What I mean by that is you can literally only use those tokens on the Nike site. You can't trade them to your friend. There's no secondary trading on an exchange like Shapeshift, etc. I think that just changes a lot of how you have to think about it. But there's real gray area, and so that's something I want to point out, because whether or not they get traded on secondary markets becomes a whole other ball of wax that we haven't gotten into just yet.
And so to clarify real quick on secondary markets, the secondary markets usually imply a securities transaction. This would be more similar, I would say token exchanges would be more similar to an eBay or to an Amazon, where you're potentially selling more of like a product type thing. So a second market has the location that it's going to be like a private chip. This is more like I'm going to sell my whatever on the token is representing some kind of good, and I'm selling it on a shopping site.
Like a let go.
But
Like let go.
Like let go. Well, when I say secondary market, I'm not implying security tokens. I'm implying that you're not using it in that closed-end system. You are trading it with someone outside of that closed-end market.
But when you buy your Pokemon cards, you never ask, is your intent to actually play the game or to resell it? Right?
Charizards are worth a lot.
Right. So I mean.
Wait, what is this game?
I don't know, my kids play Pokemon, right? They have all these little cards and like to collect them.
I know.
Yeah. So you can't. I don't think it's fair to go down the rabbit hole and start saying, well, when the buyer bought all these digital coins, they really didn't intend to consume them. They intended to go out and resell them, and I don't know if it's relevant. I mean, one of the areas we've tried to address in our Digital Token Act is to actually have the initial buyer acknowledge that they're not buying this for speculation, they're buying this to consume it, and maybe that's just a belt and suspenders approach and it makes us feel better that there's not this going on, but I think at the end of the day, it's hard to argue that if people buy consumer goods, some people buy them because they think the value is going to go up on my new LeBrons, or they're not, and they may just decide to wear them, or they may decide to put them in their cabinet. But if you can actually consume them, then I think the securities laws say then that shouldn't be a security. We totally just took over the question. You're like a live debate right now. Please, if you find us afterwards, we have these great debates in our Colorado Blockchain Council meetings, open to the public. Securities Working Group, we'd love to get everyone on this panel involved, of course, who isn't already, and all of you. Because this is kind of stuff we love debating.
Well, right, because it's, what I'm saying is like, a lot of this is gray area, but this is what it looks like, right, to navigate the gray area, and that's what makes legislating it so incredibly hard, right? And in so many ways, you have to legislate trying to guess what the intentions are. I like that you're taking an innocence until proven guilty approach.
Well, yeah, or trying to take Howie out of the equation. So Howie relies on this mythical buyer, that what expectations that the buyer had after the fact, after they bought, right? So in the Orange Grove example, the guy was selling orange plots and he was breaking them up, and you could sell a plot to somebody and then you could also buy a service contract back. And the Supreme Court said, well, the buyer intended to rely on the manager of the plots to make them money. Well, there were a lot of buyers that just bought the plots. But that one mythical buyer, the Supreme Court said, well, that means that now it's a security. This whole thing's a security, right? That's a very ex-ante decisions by judges and fact finders years later. In your class action lawsuit example, is very difficult for entrepreneurs to navigate. So what we're trying to focus the legislation on is before the fact, ex post decisions, right? So that we can say, developer, if you do these things, if you have a consumptive purpose, if you don't market this for speculative purpose, if you get this acknowledgement, if you go live within a certain period of time, we feel comfortable that that would not be, or should not be deemed reasonably a security. So it's, again, trying to move regulation a little bit and make it more reasonable for entrepreneurs and developers.
A case in point to weigh, so 2 points. One is, as a founder, I'm probably the one that should be even more frustrated with regulators and lack regulators, and I'm also the one who's thinking creatively around how to get around it, right, or how to navigate within it, right? So as this conversation so well lays out, is that this is really complex, and if I were to think about doing a tokenized venture fund, if I were to really try to do this, I could say, okay, my use case is that any investor as an LP into our fund gets a lifetime subscription to every company I ever invest in. So if we invest in Facebook, Twitch, and MySpace, like, you get to have lifetime free whatever. That's an interesting use case that I could like try to navigate. I'm not going to, but this conversation kind of makes that like, maybe we could. Secondly, like in the esports and video gaming space, because that's what we're focused on, is there are pro teams that have tens of millions of fans, like Liquid or Optic or TSM or all these guys that have tens of million fans. They're come to me asking them, can we do a utility token offering to tokenize our tens of millions of fans who would buy it for $20 a piece. They could raise hundreds of millions of dollars in seconds. And so I'm consulting with the owners and I'm like, maybe, like I would do it as a security token just to be safe. But as this conversation kind of lays out, there is a use case of they have a built product, they have tens of millions of fans, they've got tons of teams. It's a, you know, as you guys are pointing out, like there's something there. And so, I don't know. I'm going to tell them to do a security token just because I think they're going to get screwed in the near term because they're looking to do that like in the next 12 months. But I don't know. That's my world of like what's going on, especially since gamers are like, you know, Black Ops 4 just dropped last night and like all this stuff. So like gamers are the most digitally native people, so they're actually the best like adoption for a lot of this stuff, and they get it. Tokens are a 20-year-old concept in gaming, and so it's fascinating to watch what's happening. But as this conversation lays out, there is a path forward, but without forward-thinking states like Colorado, I guess, it might be a little tougher in California or Texas.
Kind of shifting back to what you said, Eric, what would be your advice for students in terms of getting involved in the legislation side and just young people in general? We're going to see this out in the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Well, I guess just as I think John mentioned earlier, just consume. There's so much good information out there, whether it's CoinDesk or podcasts or Colorado Blockchain Council meetings, where just educate yourselves on what's going on. At our blockchain hub event in Denver Startup Week, somebody asked, well, do you guys think this is like the marijuana legalization initiative? And I can see parallels, but the big difference is in the marijuana situation, that was a citizen-led over probably decades, 30, 40 years of people standing up and saying this is stupid and why are we making this illegal? We'll just go around the politicians and we'll just pass it ourselves. You don't see that right now, at least in sort of cryptocurrency, blockchain sort of investment interest. There's a lot of folks out there that have no idea what this is. So if we're going to get to that point where public opinion will push legislation to a point where the legislators will finally agree that, okay, we hear you and we'll relent, that's what I think young people can do is focus on why this is important to them, why this matters, why a Internet 3.0 should be a big thing we should all be working for, why the Internet we know today does not really capture the value, the peer-to-peer that we want, why privacy is important, all these things. And so if you sort of can marshal the folks, then I think you can, that's a worthwhile endeavor.
I'm going to say, so Eric says consume, 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 and I'm going to say discern, 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 because there is so much terrible information and horrible writing. It is amazing. I'm just personally impressed. So make sure that when you decide to consume, who's behind it, what's their agenda, are they objective, do they have good research practices? Always. Because there's, just being on Medium, unfortunately, some people perceive it to be legitimized because it looks nice, but there's a lot of terrible information, so make sure that you're using really legitimized data when you're actually trying to understand this world. And the other thing I would say is hold accountable, because I don't know if you've watched any of the congressional testimonies, but when Mark Zuckerberg was up there, I swear there were legislators who basically said, explain the internets to me, right? And so I think you have to hold people accountable to continue learning about this, especially if they're representing you, because what I've seen, at least at the federal level, is just an unacceptable level of understanding prior to legislating something. And so I would say the only way that's going to get better is if we ensure that people are educated.
I would agree with both of those directives. I would also say compare and build. A lot of the conversations that we have, like about cryptocurrency right now, they're focused on securities laws, which at their core were enacted as a measure to protect, consumers, just people who are existing in their day-to-day lives. How many other, contractual arrangements does our society uphold and allow to remain in place when they're just as restrictive? They cause just as many deviations from a high quality of life. How many people would like to get out of their 2-year restrictive cell phone contract? Like, what if you could tokenize those? Like, I think you're all, a lot of the people in the audience are in a place to really challenge the way that things are being done and take hold of this technology and see what can come of it. So,
I think we're going to open up to audience questions now, so if anyone has any questions, give the mic over to you.
I think you made a really good point on sort of the parochial nature of SEC laws, as we're getting some questions in here. The SEC is, I guess, looking at bringing down the definition of accredited investor. So accredited investor are kind of the rich people and the rich banks, institutions out there that the law says, well, we don't have to worry about you. You can kind of buy as much as you want. And so, I don't know. Like, again, this is a policy discussion. If you have a lot of money, you can go to Canyon City and you can blow it all away in gambling too, and no one's like, oh, well, you didn't have enough money to do that. But the difference is the state gets a lot of money from that, right, in taxes. So you got it. I think that's your point. I mean, all the folks in the room, the college students, think about what quote consumer protection means for you. And think about it like with a real kind of fresh, clean slate. Like, is it a libertarian viewpoint that you espouse? Is it just I don't need somebody to tell me what I want? Are there situations where the government should sort of prevent me from doing certain things or not? These are really tough questions. I certainly don't have the answers, but understanding the sort of how things can be a little bit contradictory in that way, I think is really important to help all of us sort of move forward with the right framework.
All right, well, let's open up to the questions from the audience. Does anybody have a question that they'd like to start with?
Hi, my name is Ziping Walter. I'm a faculty member at University of Colorado, Denver. Actually, my question is about corporate structure with the blockchain companies. And Ethereum is structured as a nonprofit, a not-for-profit, right? And I was just kind of wondering how, what percentage of these blockchain companies are structured as not-for-profit? Do they actually satisfy that definition of not-for-profit? Is that something that should be regulated, as if it doesn't sound to me that they're really not-for-profit? And if somebody is to start a blockchain company, how should they structure their corporate structure? Not-for-profit or for-profit, even with the for-profit, limited partnerships or corporations? Because there's a difference in whether or not you can issue stocks. And another thing is about how the cryptocurrency as a representation of your share of your company, if it's not a corporation, something that cannot issue shares. So how, if somebody is gonna start a company, how do they think about these issues and what corporate structure would be suitable?
I'll see if I can cover some of that. I'd love some help.
Eric,
thank you for your question. So what you're referring to the nonprofit is what we kind of refer to as the foundation model, which is basically companies that go to Switzerland and establish a foundation under Swiss law that then raises money through donations to the foundation. That money is then flowed back to an operating company that actually develops the technology. And so there's an arrangement between the operating company and the foundation, or the trustees of the foundation, to what projects to fund within that. That's how Ethereum, for example, started, and others. And there's been...
Or just to clarify, there's actually two companies then. You've got the foundation and the separate.
So the foundation would be governed by Swiss law, and the operating company could be anywhere in the world, and some are here in the US, but they're not actually the ones receiving the funds. They're just building the technology that then, once it's live, then the people that have donated are entitled, or at least there's been some promise that they'll receive a token if and when this operating company has been successful. There's a lot of problems with that. There's a lot of, you can read all about sort of Tezos and all of their issues. And ultimately this goes to this idea of foundation model versus doing it in Singapore or because of regulatory clarifications there, or doing it here in the US. All comes down to what we've called regulatory arbitrage, which is if you have very sort of challenging laws in the US, the money is just going to go to a different jurisdiction where the laws are more clear. So that's one of the the reasons why we're trying to do something in Colorado, to sort of allow us to put a stake in the ground as the place that is welcoming, that has thought about this issue, and then also hopefully encourage the federal government to do that. So I think to your question on whether those companies comply with nonprofit laws or what the right structure of those companies are, it really does depend on risk appetite. Do you want to go to Switzerland to set this up? Do you feel like I just will just stay in the US and I'll be fine? Should I go to the Caymans or Malta and other jurisdictions because of uncertainty? It ultimately comes down to kind of a risk discussion in terms of how that's done. If you're issuing a security token, those are generally going to be just treated like any other stock or partnership interest. They're intended to be the same way, just happen to be in digital format.
How many people are planning on starting a company in here? Raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is for you, I think. What I've noticed with a lot of founders who come to us is, so I am not a lawyer, and I will not get into the legal part of this discussion. However, I would encourage you to think about not only where you are, what jurisdiction you're planning on basing your business in, but understand what the tax implications will be of that. Not only at issuance or standing up, but also down the line, especially for your investors. So often people only think about what is convenient in the now. And there are many, many, many options. And make sure you get a great international law firm that is operating in a lot of different jurisdictions that can give you visibility.
My only other addition is particularly on your nonprofit point. It's an excellent observation that I think a lot of folks who are entering the cryptocurrency space, they don't quite understand that as a technical matter, nonprofits don't have owners, and only a few of them have members, and there are different governance rights that are associated there, and you can give them a lot of regulatory hot water if you're not careful about the way that your revenues are flowing through, et cetera. And so I think there are also a lot of really interesting models. John was mentioning co-op, et cetera, especially in Colorado. That's a really popular and functional way to think of alternative ownership and distribution of profits and losses of the companies. And so I would say, look carefully at those, discuss those with your counsel, et cetera. That's also quite important.
As we're doing at SCO, so I'll just share a little bit of our corporate structure. So we're a C Corp out of Delaware. That company, a lot of funds in the United States actually are based out of the Cayman for tax efficiencies for LPs. So to Shayla's point, tax efficiency is very important, especially since a lot of our investors in the fund are from the Middle East and also from South America, as well as the United States. And so you create a Cayman entity which dodges a lot of really, really high US taxes on foreign investors. And so it's a C Corp out of Delaware, we have a Cayman fund, and then actually the only thing that's different about a tokenized fund is the fact they're issuing tokens for the LP interest. The LP interest is then liquid on the secondary market. Those tokens are issued out of British Virgin Islands, a BVI entity. So the BVI entity is the sole LP into the Cayman entity. And so that's the way we're structured, right or wrong. To your point, we have a global law firm, international law firm. They've set up hundreds of funds, and so we are following the same-ish roadmap, but the only thing that's different is this BVI entity, specifically for my business model.
Is that a 3C1 fund, or does it even fall under the investment company act?
It's going to fall under the investment company act.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you limited to the two? They just upped it to 250 investors accredited.
For the U.S. investors,
Yeah.
we're sticking at 99 right now, but I can look into that. It's a good idea.
Does anybody else have any questions that they'd like to ask?
I think in my experience, the most entities that we come across are just straight up Delaware C Corps. They're tech companies. Any money they receive is being reinvested into the operation. So any corporate tax liabilities are probably going to be nil. And you're working to ensure compliance with U.S. law. So even if you do have money in the Caymans or British or Singapore, if you're personally still in the U.S., the regulators still can get you. So you may not be able to get the money out of it, but your personal is often more valuable anyway. So that's generally what we're seeing, just straight up Delaware C Corps.
And just to be clear, when you mentioned Ethereum, so Ethereum is like a protocol, more like a platform, and then there's blockchain companies that are actually C Corps. Simplify that.
I think people are hungry.
No, we're standing between them and food. It's precarious.
All right, well, we have an announcement from John E. Carpenter, who is the co-founder of the Global Blockchain Summit. So let's just wait for him to get up to the stage, and then he will talk.
And one last thought on crowdfunding ICOs in general. So it was mentioned earlier that the Securities Act of 1933 and then the Investment Company Act of 1934 or 1940, those were initially meant to protect investors in a time where people were selling securities that weren't worth anything, and that's one of the reasons that caused the Great Depression. I think now that we are in this new kind of phase of you can sell whether it's a security or a token for a consumptive purpose through the internet, what's going to be really important is disclosures. So I think what we're going to start looking at, or how laws are going to change, is if the buyer, whether it's an investment or again a consumptive purpose, is aware of what they're buying and then knows what they're purchasing. I think that's what we're going to see how regulators look at it. So it's going to be interesting to see over the next course of 10 years how this is all going to play out. Because crowdfunding just came out, you're now seeing tokens being regulated, and I think it's going to come down to disclosures. And a lot of the fraud that I've personally seen with ICOs is promising massive returns, and that's wrong. So that's one of the things I think a lot of regulators are trying to curtail.
Well, thank you so much.